Crimea 2014, the prelude to war you never understood. They rolled in at dawn, didn't they? No flags. No insignia. Just well-trained soldiers in unmarked uniforms, moving with chilling precision. Within days, they'd seized an entire peninsula, and within weeks, the map of Europe was redrawn by force. Most of the world just shrugged, called it unacceptable, then moved on to the next headline. 8 years later, those same streets in Ukraine were burning from Kharkiv to Mariupol. Spoiler, this was never a separate incident, it was chapter 1 of the same horrifying book. It was the opening act of a drama many chose to ignore. Hit the subscribe button now. Let's continue tonight. We're rewinding to the moment the dominoes started falling, slowly, deliberately. We'll walk through the cover, audacious seizure of Crimea, the grinding trench war that festered in Donbas, and the so-called peace deals that, let's be honest, satisfied nobody and solved precisely nothing. By the end, you'll see why the full-scale invasion of February 2022 wasn't some shocking bolt from the blue. Far from it. It was the logical, almost tragically inevitable, continuation of a campaign that began in the shadows of 2014. Section 1. The heist in Crimea. Ukraine's revolution had just toppled President Yanukovych on February 22, 2014. Kyiv's parliament was still reeling, still scrambling to appoint a caretaker government, when mysterious troops started appearing at Simferopol airport. They wore modern Russian-issue gear, but their sleeves were conspicuously bare, no national insignia. Locals quickly nicknamed them Little Green Men, a chillingly casual term for a calculated military maneuver. Moscow looked the cameras in the eye and, with a straight face, said, "Those aren't ours." That brazen denial held for weeks, long enough for the troops to fan out, encircle Ukrainian bases, block roads, and lock down communications across the peninsula. The playbook was chillingly simple. First, seize the parliament building at night, then replace the local prime minister with a little-known, fiercely pro-Russian politician, Sergei Aksyonov. Next, announce a referendum. Ballots appeared within days, complete with a single, glaringly leading question: do you want to join Russia? Voting took place on March 16 under the omnipresent, watchful gaze of those same unmarked soldiers. International observers were, of course, barred. Official results claimed an improbable 97% in favor and an 83% turnout. 2 days later, Vladimir Putin signed the treaty absorbing Crimea into the Russian Federation. Just like that, a landmass roughly the size of Massachusetts changed hands without a single recognized shot fired, a masterclass in hybrid warfare. So, why did it work so quickly? Ukraine's military, tragically, was hollowed out by years of corruption. Its intelligence services were deeply infiltrated. The new government in Kyiv was still finding its feet, still figuring out who would pick up the phone. They were vulnerable. Meanwhile, Russia's Black Sea Fleet was already stationed in Sevastopol, giving Moscow perfect, undeniable cover to quietly ship in extra troops and equipment. The West responded with what it considered its strongest weapons: targeted travel bans and asset freezes on a handful of Russian officials. Diplomats, ever the optimists, called the annexation illegal but reversible. But reversible, as we painfully learned, turned out to be nothing more than a dangerous fantasy. Section 2. The dawn was sparked with Crimea firmly in Russia's grasp. You might think things would calm down. But no, not at all. Eastern Ukraine, specifically the industrial heartlands of Donetsk and Luhansk, was growing increasingly restless. Factories there had long fed the national budget. Many locals genuinely feared the revolution in Kyiv would shutter them. Russian state television, a powerful propaganda tool, didn't just amplify that anxiety, it weaponized it, portraying Ukraine's new leaders as dangerous fascists bent on banning the Russian language. What started as street protests quickly morphed into armed seizures of city halls and police stations in April 2014. Again, new leaders seemed to appear almost overnight, immediately declaring so-called People's Republics. Ukrainian officials, rightly, called the movement a Russian-orchestrated diversion, Russia, predictably, called it a grassroots uprising. Whatever label you chose to put on it, the reality on the ground was stark. Weapons, ammunition, and battle-hardened veterans soon began pouring across the porous Russian border. It wasn't subtle. Suddenly, you had tanks without serial numbers appearing out of nowhere. Then, even more alarmingly, the advanced Buk missile system showed up, the very same system that would tragically be used to shoot down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, killing all 298 people on board. Ukrainian forces, caught off guard, launched what they termed an anti-terrorist operation. The separatists, backed by their unseen patrons, simply called it war. Towns like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk became brutal battlegrounds, swapping hands multiple times in desperate house-to-house fighting. By August, it was clear this wasn't just a proxy conflict. Russia was rotating regular army battalions through the border, often under the cynical euphemism of humanitarian convoys. Kyiv quickly realized it was facing a military force far better equipped and organized than the relatively bloodless Crimea takeover might have suggested. The battles at Ilovaisk and Debaltseve became grim symbols of this new reality, with encircled Ukrainian troops fighting desperately to break out under relentless artillery fire, leaving hundreds dead in their wake. The front lines eventually froze, yes, but the shooting? The shelling? That never really stopped. It just settled into a low, simmering boil. Section 3, Life in the Trench. The conflict in Donbas, after its initial chaotic phase, settled into a grim, World War I-style stalemate. Imagine trenches, stretching for more than 400 kilometers, snaking across fields and through villages. This wasn't some distant conflict, both sides were dug in so close that positions were sometimes less than 300 meters apart. Drones became ubiquitous, buzzing overhead to correct artillery fire, making every exposed movement a gamble. For the civilians who couldn't, or wouldn't, leave, life became an unimaginable struggle. They lived in basements, their only sanctuaries, venturing out to fetch water or food under the constant threat of shellfire. Schools hung heavy sandbags over windows, not for decoration, but for protection. Playgrounds, once filled with children's laughter, became terrifying, silent minefields. By early 2022, the human cost had crept past a staggering 14,000 dead, and among them, a heartbreaking 3,000 civilians, ordinary people caught in an extraordinary hell. Another 2 million people were displaced, forced to flee their homes, some west into safer parts of Ukraine, others east into Russia, leaving everything behind. And then there were the ceasefires. Every so often, one would be announced, usually timed to coincide with some new round of peace talks in Minsk. But they all followed the same, tragic rhythm: the first day, an eerie, almost hopeful silence. The second day, sporadic rifle fire, a few warning shots. And by the third day? Full-blown heavy artillery duels, as if nothing had ever changed. Journalists, with a weary cynicism born of experience, quickly nicknamed it the 72-hour peace. It was a cruel joke, a brief lull before the storm inevitably returned. Section 4, the Minsk-trapped diplomats, desperate to show the world they were doing something, needed a diplomatic fig leaf. They ended up with two. The first, Minsk I, signed in September 2014, was a fragile agreement promising a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, and the initiation of constitutional dialogue. It was a glimmer of hope, however faint. But that glimmer quickly faded. Within months, it had utterly collapsed, shattered by renewed separatist offensives, heavily backed by Russia, leading to devastating Ukrainian losses. Enter Minsk II, a far more comprehensive, 13-point plan, hammered out in February 2015, immediately after Ukraine's bloody and humiliating defeat at Debaltseve. This agreement was supposed to be the real deal: pull back all tanks and heavy artillery, exchange prisoners, grant Donbas a special autonomous status within Ukraine, and, here's the crucial part, restore Ukrainian control over its own border with Russia. Sounds good, right? The problem was, implementation stalled immediately. It was a trap, meticulously laid. Here's where the trap became painfully obvious. Kyiv, quite reasonably, argued that granting special autonomy to Donbas simply couldn't happen until Russia withdrew its troops and weapons. How could you negotiate with a gun to your head? Moscow, predictably, dug in its heels, insisting that the border could not be returned to Ukrainian control until Kyiv granted that autonomy. This effectively handed the separatists, and by extension, Russia, a perpetual veto power over Ukraine's foreign policy, ensuring Ukraine could never truly align with the West. European monitors from the US were deployed, yes, but their hands were tied. They could move freely on Ukrainian-held territory, diligently documenting violations. But on the separatist side, they were routinely blocked, denied access at checkpoints, their mandates rendered practically useless. In the end, Minsk II didn't solve the conflict, it simply froze it. It was just enough to take the most brutal fighting off primetime news, to allow the world to look away, but certainly not enough to heal the gaping wound that had been inflicted. Both sides, in their own ways, used this uneasy stalemate to rearm and prepare. Ukraine rotated tens of thousands of its troops through the Donbas trenches, forging a battle-hardened army. Meanwhile, the separatists, with continuous Russian backing, transformed cities like Donetsk into formidable fortress towns, bristling with advanced Russian hardware. Western diplomats, in hushed tones, would later admit that the Minsk agreements were less about achieving genuine peace and more about simply buying time. But time, as we now know, is a finite resource. And for Ukraine, that time tragically ran out on February 24, 2022. Section 5, The Human Cost You Didn't See. Beyond the grand geopolitical narratives, the endless headlines about troop movements, and the sterile language of diplomatic protocols, there was a profound, heartbreaking human cost. Ordinary people, men, women, and children, paid the steepest price. In Crimea, the indigenous Tatar minority, who overwhelmingly opposed the annexation, faced systematic repression. Their elected representative body, the Mejlis, was shut down. Their leaders were banned, exiled. Police raids on homes became chillingly common, often conducted under vague anti-extremism laws designed to silence dissent. In Donbas, the daily grind was even more brutal. Imagine being a pensioner, your meager Ukrainian benefits your only source of income, forced to cross the heavily militarized front line at dawn, queuing for hours in freezing temperatures or scorching heat, just to collect what was rightfully yours. Children grew up with the thud of artillery fire not as a terrifying anomaly, but as normal background noise, woven into the fabric of their childhoods. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe, hospitals on both sides of the line were catastrophically unprepared, lacking even the most basic supplies. Intensive care units in some separatist areas were a horrifying throwback, relying on Soviet-era ventilators jury-rigged to gasoline generators. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Meanwhile, sanctions, while intended to punish Russia, battered Crimea's once bustling tourism industry. The vibrant promenades of Yalta, once thronged with visitors, transformed into desolate rows of shuttered cafes, ghosts of a past prosperity. Every statistic you hear, 14,000 dead, 2 million displaced, isn't just a number. It represents a family torn apart, a chair empty at the dinner table, a future stolen. The world largely looked away, didn't it? Because the shooting, they told themselves, stayed local. Until, of course, it didn't. Section 6, The Bridge to 2022. By late 2021, the warning signs were flashing neon. Satellite imagery, stark and undeniable, showed Russia systematically stacking armor, fuel trucks, and field hospitals along three sides of Ukraine's borders. It wasn't subtle, it was a massive, unmistakable military buildup. Diplomatic cables flew back and forth in a frantic flurry, filled with the same weary, almost hollow phrases: de-escalation, costs and consequences, grave concern. European leaders, in a last-ditch effort, flew to Moscow, desperately offering renewed talks on the long-dead Minsk agreements. But Putin's demands were unequivocal, and frankly, outrageous. He insisted NATO roll back to its 1997 borders, effectively dismantling the post-Cold War security architecture. The translation of his demands was chillingly clear: recognize Crimea as Russian territory, accept indefinite separatist control over Donbas, and permanently rule out Ukrainian membership in NATO, or any Western alliance, forever. Kyiv, staring down the barrel of a gun, saw the writing on the wall. On February 21, Russia officially recognized the sham separatist republics in Donbas, tearing up the Minsk agreements once and for all. Just 3 days later, the full-scale invasion began. The tactics that had worked so effectively in 2014, the speed, the surprise, the brazen denial, largely failed across an entire country the size of Texas. But that doesn't mean 2014 was irrelevant. Far from it. The groundwork, both physical and psychological, had been meticulously laid years earlier, the trenches dug, the supply lines rehearsed, the propaganda narratives refined and rehearsed. The world gasped at the audacity of the 2022 invasion, yet every single move, every strategic decision, carried the unmistakable fingerprints of 2014. It was the same playbook, just on a terrifyingly larger scale. If this video has rewired your sense of how we truly got here, if it's opened your eyes to the long game that was played, then please, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the deep dives we still have coming. Drop a comment below with the part that surprised you most. The algorithm loves engagement, and honestly, so do I. And critically, share this with anyone who still thinks 2022 was a sudden, impulsive decision, rather than the culmination of an 8-year strategy. Let's make sure these lessons aren't lost to history. Look, the annexation of Crimea was never a one-off adventure, was it? It was the prototype, the trial run, the blueprint. The grinding war in Donbas wasn't some distant sideshow, it was the brutal, bloody rehearsal for a much larger conflict. And those failed peace deals? They weren't just diplomatic footnotes to be forgotten, they were the tense, uneasy intermission before the final, devastating act. When tanks rolled toward Kyiv in 2022, pundits and politicians across the globe gasped, calling it unthinkable. But for the millions of people who had been living the aftermath since 2014, for those who had seen their homes destroyed and their families torn apart, it wasn't unthinkable at all. It was simply the nightmare they had warned anyone who would listen was coming, a slow-motion catastrophe finally reaching its horrifying crescendo. If history teaches us anything here, and it absolutely does, it's that ignoring the small invasions, dismissing the local conflicts, only serves to invite the big one. It's a lesson paid for in blood, and one we absolutely cannot afford to forget. Thanks for watching, stay informed, and let's keep asking the uncomfortable questions that truly matter.